And finally, a few minutes on Muslims and Christians on war and violence. Mainly here, I'm interested in just pointing out how both Christians and Muslims have had to think about their authoritative text and the interpretive issues that arise from it. Obviously, there is a historical moment that this becomes very pronounced, specifically the Crusades. These were a series of military campaigns aimed at capturing the Holy Land, so the areas around Jerusalem, and protecting the Byzantine Empire, what had been the Eastern Roman Empire, but after the fall of the Western Roman Empire was just called the Byzantine Empire. That was right next to Muslim territory and was concerned about Muslim encroachment on that territory. Crusades were also eventually used to describe some internal campaigns in Western Europe. But the point here is that it was a period of time where two things happened, where Christians went to war against Muslims, and where Christians turned from what's often called just war, meaning the idea that war is a tragic necessity that has very clear rules around it, to what's sometimes thought of as holy war, or the idea that war itself is a holy act and can in some ways not have any limitations if it's being done for what they consider holy reasons. In the short term, Western Christians only held the land they captured for about 100 years. The Crusades were not particularly successful as a military campaign. More long term, they have led to a lot of Muslim Christian bitterness, but also a lot of Muslim Christian interaction and cross fertilization. So that's the historical moment that kind of brings up these issues related to war. But when what follows, I'm not really going to just focus on how people thought about the Crusades, but on how these two traditions think about issues of war more generally. And here are the key points. Both Muslims and Christians have an authoritative text that speaks multivocally or with multiple voices on issues related to violence and war. And both have multiple interpretive traditions, all of which use that authoritative text, but they come to different conclusions. So Muslims could read the Quran and then come to different conclusions about the conditions under which they might go to war. Christians can read the Bible and then come to different conclusions about when they might go to war, or if they should go to war at all. So let's look first at Islam. And this is a chart that lays out some of the verses that can be used by Muslims to come to one of three major positions. A position that is more emphasizes peace, a middle position that emphasizes just war or just defensive war, and then a set of verses that can be used or have been used to justify offensive war, war for reasons of conversion, for example. So let's just look at a couple of these. Along the peace side, invite all to the way of the Lord with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and argue with them in the ways that are best and most gracious. Down at the bottom, thou art a warner. You read verses like this in your reading for today, the sense that there is an impending judgment, and all you can do and all you should do is warn people of that, and then it's up to them to do what they want with that information. So not a call to go out and forcibly change anyone's mind, but a call to simply warn people about what is coming. In a defensive or just war verses, to those against whom war is made, permission is given to fight because they have been wronged. So again, here the sense that there are reasons you can go to war, but you have to have been wronged. There has to be a defensive reason that you're going. Fight in the way of Allah, those who fight you, but do not provoke hostility. God does not love aggressors. And then in the third column, fighting is prescribed for you and you dislike it. To the bottom, fight those who do not believe in Allah or the last day until they pay the poll tax. Now that's kind of an interesting one because it's actually not calling for the eradication of your enemies, only for your enemies to pay a tax. So that only goes so far for offensive war. But you can still see here a range of verses within the Quran that allow for different kinds of possibilities in terms of warfare. One of the interpretive debates in Islam concerns something called abrogation. Abrogation is the idea that later revelations abrogate or cancel out earlier revelations. Now, this is important because, again, Muhammad received revelations over the course of his life. And particularly at the end of his life, he was a military leader involved in wars against a hostile enemy, the Meccans. And so the later revelations often tend to have more to do with why you would carry out a war, the conditions under which you would, than the earlier revelations, which tend more to be about larger themes of, say, peaceful living, because, in 615, Muhammad was not in charge of an army. So abrogation would say that those later revelations that came when he was a military leader cancel out the earlier revelations that, again, tend more generally to speak about peace. Within Islam, this is by no means a universal position. Some Muslim scholars contend that the position of abrogation became a dominant position under the Abbasids, an expansionist Muslim empire, and that they used verses like, and fight the polytheists altogether as they fight you altogether, and know that God is with those who are conscious of God, to abrogate other verses, earlier verses that talked about positive relationships between Muslims and non-Muslims. So basically what these scholars, again, many times Muslim scholars, are arguing is, wow, abrogation can be a pretty convenient position if you're an empire that wants to expand. That doesn't mean it's a good interpretive position. Abrogation, like a lot of these discussions, raises the thorny question of historical context. Should you interpret an authoritative text in its historical context, and to what extent are revelations historically situated, meaning they only apply to, say, Muhammad in 624? Now, you can see why people might want to say that. Like, yeah, this is a revelation to Muhammad in 624 about a very specific issue, and you can't generalize from it. The problem with this position, and Christians have a similar fight, is that then does everything become contextual? Do your authoritative texts have no ability to speak to anything general because they're all just about specific situations? And does it become tempting every time you don't like something in your authoritative text to say, oh, that's just historically contextual? So Muslims, like Christians, have these kinds of arguments. I want to end on talking about Muslims and issues related to war and violence by talking about a modern example. And part of the reason I'm talking about this example is that one of the things that comes up a lot of times in kind of popular language about Islam is that Muslims don't condemn other Muslims for violence. You sometimes hear this in our popular culture when a Muslim group, this was particularly true when ISIS was very strong a number of years ago, that other Muslims weren't condemning them. Well, that's just not true. This is from a letter written to the then head of ISIS from Muslim scholars around the world, explaining to him why he was wrong in what he was doing in both terrorizing Muslim and non-Muslim populations. In order to find this letter, you would have to Google. It's about the first thing that comes up if you Google like Muslim responses to ISIS. So the idea that Muslims don't condemn Muslim violence just doesn't really hold any water, again, if you Google. But part of what I think is useful here is that the opening of the letter talks, again, about interpretive issues and what you have to do in order to interpret a text correctly. So listen to what it says. With regards to Quranic exegesis and the understanding of the Hadith, remember the Hadith are those stories about Muhammad, an issue in legal theory in general, the methodology set forth by God in the Quran and the Prophet in the Hadith is as follows. So here's how you interpret. To consider everything that has been revealed relating to a particular question in its entirety, without depending only on parts of it. And then to judge, if one is qualified. I think that's shade. I think they're pretty clear that the leaders of ISIS are not qualified, based on all available scriptural sources. Jumping down. Once all relevant scriptural passages have been gathered, the general has to be distinguished from the specific and the conditional from the unconditional. Also, the unequivocal passages have to be distinguished from the allegorical ones. Moreover, the reasons and circumstances for revelation for all passages and verses, in addition to all the other hermeneutical conditions that the classical imams have specified, must be understood. Therefore, it is not permissible to quote a verse or a part of a verse without thoroughly considering and comprehending everything that the Quran and Hadith relate about that point. The reason behind this is that everything in the Quran is the truth, and everything in authentic Hadith is divinely inspired, so it is not permissible to ignore any part of it. Indeed, it is imperative to reconcile all texts as much as possible, or that there may be a clear reason why one text should outweigh the other. In other words, you can't cherry pick texts from the Quran. You have to do this very complex exegetical work. You have to think about what's conditional and what's not, what's contextual and what's not. And you have to know the whole tradition in order to be able to say what you're supposed to do in a particular situation. Christians have some similar debates, and you read some of the verses that give them their debates. I'm going to just very quickly outline two standard positions within Christianity and some of the reasons for those. So on one side is a pacifist position, which says that it's never appropriate for Christians to engage in violence for any reason. You can die for somebody else, but you can't kill for anybody else. One of the main texts that people go to with this position comes from Matthew 5, where Jesus talks about the peacemakers being blessed, also about turning the other cheek. People who hold this position also just turn to the example of Jesus broadly, pointing out that Jesus did not use violence in order to bring about his kingdom. And they say that that is normative then for Christians, that you can't try to bring about the kingdom of God using any tools that Jesus did not. And they will say that Jesus died rather than kill, and that's what is incumbent upon all Christians. Pacifists will also point to the witness of the early church, which they claim is basically a pacifist tradition, that Christians were largely expected not to be soldiers, not to participate in war, were actually known for rescuing children that were left by the side of the road to die from exposure, that they were people who really embraced a robust ethic of trying to preserve life. Pacifists usually say that you need to interpret violent passages, particularly in the Old Testament, in light of Jesus. So they recognize that there are places in the Old Testament where God commands people to go to war and even to exterminate other populations. But what they will say is that those passages must be interpreted in the light of Jesus. You can't read the Bible flat. This is kind of a Gregory position, if you remember Gregory of Nyssa. And that you would need to think about how to prioritize those. They would prioritize Jesus and say, if these passages kind of come into conflict, if you can't have go exterminate people, hold together with, for God so loved the world, then God so loved the world has authoritative dominance, and you have to reinterpret the other passages. One of the key passages they have to deal with is the Romans passage, where it talks about being subject to the authorities. One thing that a lot of pacifists will point out is that the early Christians, people like Paul, had no expectation of ever being in political authority. They were a small persecuted sect. So when Paul talks about being subject to the authorities, he's not talking about what you should do should you have power. He's talking about how to live in the hostile Roman Empire. And they'll also point out that that command to be subject to the authorities isn't absolute. A lot of early Christians died because when push came to shove, they weren't willing to do what the authorities told them to do. And then finally, oftentimes, pacifists will say that the main thing that Christians are supposed to do is to witness to the kingdom, and that they are not responsible for the world turning out the right way. They're responsible for showing how to live as Christians. And that means that there are just outcomes that you're not going to be able to control, what you do is that you don't kill, you die. And many pacifist traditions have been pretty clear about that, that you may have to die for this, you won't necessarily see success. On the other side is the Christian just war tradition. This again is the tradition that says that there are conditions under which people have to go to war or might need to go to war. And then there are boundaries, meaning you can't do anything you want in a war. You have to do things usually proportionally in a war. You can't attack civilians and those sorts of things. People on this side point to things like Paul's letter to the Romans, where Paul talked about being subject to the authorities, and say that God has given government authorities the role of protecting people, and sometimes that means going to war. They'll point to passages in the New Testament where Jesus commends people like centurions and soldiers and never tells them to give up their occupation. There is no call in the New Testament for people who were employed by the army to stop being so. People in the just war tradition will also point to the Old Testament and say that God does command war in the Old Testament, and we can't just discount that. They often say we have to hold the Old Testament and the New Testament together. Some of them will say because they should not conflict, that if they are conflicting for you, you're just reading them wrong. Others would say that there can be conflict, but we can't simply discount something that happens pretty frequently in the Old Testament, which is God using war in order to achieve certain ends. People in the just war tradition will also say that the love command means protecting the innocent, that loving your neighbor as yourself can mean in certain situations that you go to war against bullies, against autocrats, against people taking over Western Europe, if the situation calls for that. And often these folks will make a distinction between personal and political responsibility. They'll claim that what Jesus called for, say, turning the other cheek is how you should respond personally to your enemies, but that's different than the political call. So what you are supposed to do in your one-on-one relationships is different than what Christians are supposed to do, broadly construed. Some people talk about this as difference between what we're called to do as individuals being love and what we're called to do as communities being justice. Once again, we have people looking at an authoritative text and thinking through different ways of coming at it. What do you prioritize? What do you assume about the way the text holds together? What's the role of, say, human experience? What are human responsibilities? What are the responsibilities given to the community in the authoritative text? And they come to very different conclusions. I'll end here with what the author of your text, I'm going to end with what the author of your text, Feldmeyer, talks about on religion and violence. And what his point is kind of a pessimistic ending perhaps, but it's simply to say this, that both Christians and Muslims have just war traditions, and both Christians and Muslims have violated them, not in the sense of being pacifists, but in the senses of violating the prescriptions of just war. So going to war for reasons that just war wouldn't allow, and using tactics that just war wouldn't allow. However, he also makes the point, and I think it's one worth making, that in the 20th century, most of the great wars were secular. They were done under the guise of nation states. So that for a lot of people, they want to claim that religion fuels violence. Feldmeyer would say that perhaps we should think of it in a different way, that people go to war and people will use religious traditions to do so, but they'll also use secular reasons. Feldmeyer doesn't make this point, but there are theologians, both Muslim and Christian, who suggest that really the responsibility of religious people is to dig deep in their traditions and to at least advocate for a more robust just war policy, which would mean being willing to tell nation states that there are things that, say, Christian or Muslim soldiers simply will not do. It's an interesting debate. It's interesting to read about. In a normal semester, you'd be reading more about it. But for now, that's all we're going to do on this question. And when we come back next week, we're going to talk about Thomas Aquinas.